Hello, this is the UCLA Housing Voice podcast, and I'm your host, Shane Phillips. This week's episode is with Professor Hyojung Lee, and we're talking about how gentrification may have different displacement impacts depending on the kind of metro area where it's occurring, and how big those differences actually are. The relationship between gentrification and residential displacement has been surprisingly difficult to confirm with empirical research. That's partly because definitions of gentrification differ, but even more importantly because measuring displacement is really hard, especially when we try to isolate involuntary displacement from other kinds of moves. By grouping together different kinds of metro areas by their shared characteristics, Hyojung and his co-author Kristin Perkins arguably have made the most persuasive case yet that there really is a statistically significant association between gentrification and the more harmful kinds of residential mobility. At the same time, they've also given us a deeper understanding of how gentrification's impacts can differ depending on whether someone lives in a large coastal metro area, a smaller Midwestern one, a retirement destination, or a college town, or one of several other place categories. We talk with Hyojung about how they put together this major research effort, what they found, and what it means for how we think about gentrification, and what we still need to learn to better inform our efforts at preventing and mitigating displacement. The Housing Voice podcast is a production of the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, with production support from Claudia Bustamante and Jason Suteja, and Divine Mutoni helping us out on transcripts. You can email me at shanephillips@ucla.edu, and you can give the show a 5-star rating at Apple or Spotify. Now let's get to our conversation with Professor Hyojung Lee. Hyojung Lee is Assistant Professor of Housing and Property Management at Virginia Tech in what might be my favorite department name ever, the Department of Apparel, Housing, and Resource Management. And he's here today to talk with us about the different forms gentrification can take, including a classification system he's developed with one of our previous guests, Kristin Perkins. Gentrification is sometimes talked about like it's a monolithic concept or force. But Hyojung and Kristin's work is helping shed some light on how its characteristics and impacts differ depending on the kind of community you're looking at. So that's what we're going to talk about. Hyojung, thanks for being here and welcome to the Housing Voice podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here today.
And my co-host today is Mike Lenz. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Shane. Welcome to Hyojung, and really looking forward to today's conversation.
So we're going to start off with a tour of a place our guest knows well, and he has picked Seoul. I will say he kind of wanted to do Los Angeles, but we've heard quite a bit of that, and I don't know that we've had a tour of Seoul, so we kind of pushed him in that direction. I've never been. I don't know about you, Mike, but
Nope.
Hyojung, where are you taking us?
Sure. So I've lived in many places and love most of them for different reasons. But if I must choose one, I would like to invite you guys to Seoul, which is the capital city of the South Korea, and a huge city that has about 10 million people. So it's quite similar to LA's, population size, right? So the thing that I like the most about the city is its wide variety of urban spaces. I mean, if you've ever tried Korean food bibimbap, have you ever tried it?
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
We live in Los Angeles. Come on.
Right, like it's this kind of mixed rice with like lots of the meats and vegetables. Seoul is just like that. It has so many places with unique local character, and the very organic way that those neighborhoods are mixed makes the city very diverse and dynamic. And in the city, you can find 100-year-old like palaces or traditional Korean houses right next to skyscrapers and modern architecture. And then, for those planners, maybe I would recommend visiting Cheonggyecheon, which is a restored stream in downtown Seoul. So that was a major project that basically removed a highway in the heart of the city, like I-110 in LA or I-90 in Chicago, and created open spaces along those 300 lines, restored stream.
If you're like an urbanist who's been online in the past 10 years, you've definitely seen a before and after of this former freeway, now stream and kind of public open space. Yeah.
Sure. So you definitely saw that kind of pictures of Cheonggyecheon like before. Yeah. So it was so dramatic. And, that was the moment that people in Seoul and in Korea in general realized that there are more important things like the environment, like quality of life and sustainability than just kind of efficiency and growth that we had, pursued during the, rapid economic growth period. So, so I think that is a great kind of example, great site to visit for urban planners.
So this is pretty simplistic, but I got to imagine that there's a lot more familiarity with Korean culture to an extent for Americans these days due to the kind of explosion of Korean cinema and I mean, I don't know if I would call Squid Games and like The 100 or whatever like cinema, but it's speaking very anecdotally and personally, like I feel like, through Netflix or, cinema or whatever, like I'm actually observing something about a country that, I knew mostly as like a growing economic powerhouse in Asia, but didn't have any window into kind of like what life was like there. But I don't know if others feel the same.
Well, there's the cinema, there's the TV, there's also like K-pop, K-beauty. Yeah. I mean, that's not necessarily giving you the sense of what it's like there, but the cultural inroads have been massive in the past like decade or so for sure.
Yeah. That's what I'm trying to say. Better said, Shane.
So in terms of that kind of cultural thing, just one thing that I want to interest more is the nightlife in Seoul. Like nightlife is something that makes Seoul special. And that's something that I miss a lot here in the United States.
Yeah.
So, suppose that you arrive in Korea like 11 p.m. and then somehow cannot fall asleep due to maybe jet lags or something like that. But no worries in Korea. I mean, there are so many places to go, like from 24-hour restaurants to karaoke to night market and it's street food. There's so many things to do. So if you saw kind of 24-hour kind of restaurants in Koreatown, that is our culture. So basically the city runs 24/7. And I like that kind of lively, atmosphere within the city so much.
Yeah, I definitely am down to travel to Seoul and like hop off the plane and go to karaoke. I got no problem with that.
100%. This is very much going on a tangent here, but I heard something a while ago, some other podcast, but they were talking about how that culture actually developed in South Korea and how it was at least in part a result of the kind of repressive political system, 30 years ago, whenever, and how there was like a curfew. You couldn't be out after a certain time. Right. So people would go out to these clubs and bars and just stay until daylight so they wouldn't get in trouble. And and then it just became part of the culture, which is such an interesting story. I mean, correct me if that's entirely wrong, but that's my recollection.
That's exactly correct. So, I recently saw a movie, 1986, what happened in Argentina during their authoritarian regime and after the coup d'etat. And that was exactly the same what happened in Korea. So in 1960s and 70s, people couldn't go out during the night. And there was so oppressive, authoritarian kind of government in Korea. So people couldn't have that kind of freedom. And then in 1980s and 90s, we had some spring in Seoul and lots of the things we enjoy. So that is part of the reason why those K-pop things and then like K-drama, K-movies are so thriving in these days because we really wanted to express ourselves through movies, dramas, and songs. And we couldn't do that for several decades. And now we are allowed to do that. So we are kind of...
Yeah. Well, let's just pretend like we've got a great transition from that to gentrification. I mean, hey, like clubs and bars coming in, that's kind of gentrification. Who knows?
We can talk about this like forever, but we should move on, right?
Sure. So the paper we're discussing was published last year in the journal Social Forces, and it's titled The Geography of Gentrification and Residential Mobility. In this study, I would say you're looking at gentrification through three lenses. First is the intensity of change, or how much a place is gentrified. Second is residential mobility, which is sort of a proxy for displacement, but not a perfect one because only a fraction of moves are forced or involuntary. And third is the characteristics of the place itself, where that gentrification is occurring and in whatever ways it's occurring. Bringing these all together, the idea is that if you were to control for the amount of gentrification that's happening, and we'll get into how you measure that momentarily, you might find that the amount of residential mobility or displacement specifically varies depending on whether you're in a highly productive coastal city, an area that's popular with retirees or college students, or a rapidly growing metro in the Sun Belt, for example. A lot of previous gentrification research only looks at the US as a whole, which could be hiding some local variation, or at a single city or metro area, which can be hard to generalize to other places. So your work represents, I think, a big step forward by looking at gentrification and residential mobility in clusters of places that share similar characteristics. You did indeed find that gentrification affects residential mobility differently depending on what kind of metro area a neighborhood is located in. So we're going to get into those findings in this conversation. But before we get there, I think we first want to make sure that we're on the same page about definitions. Gentrification is, at this point, a notoriously slippery concept that for some people has a very specific meaning, like, for example, a change in neighborhood demographics that's accompanied by a rise in forced or involuntary displacement of lower income renters. For other people, the meaning is much less precise and could really refer to pretty much any neighborhood change, whether that's a bike lane coming in or a new wave coffee shop or the construction of a 4-story building. Residential mobility is something we discussed in our episode with Kristin Perkins, and it's sort of an umbrella term that includes involuntary displacement, but also many other kinds of moves that don't necessarily have negative connotations. To make sure that we don't have you using these words in one way and our audience interpreting them in another, tell us how you define gentrification and residential mobility. When it comes to your research, what processes or changes or impacts do you associate with those terms? And we can come back to the ways that you actually measure gentrification and mobility a little bit later. But for now, let's just get on the same page about what these mean to you as concepts.
Sure. And this was the exact reason that I avoided using the term gentrification in any of my prior research to this one. Mm-hmm. Just like, other urban phenomena, like urban sprawl, suburb, and neighborhood, we have a vague idea in our head, but that concept does not necessarily have a kind of very clear-cut kind of definition. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about gentrification, people often say, what does it mean? or, gentrification is not what you think it is, right? So as you mentioned, some think gentrification involves the displacement of original and often low-income residents, and sometimes substantial changes in racial and ethnic character. But others don't agree with that. So yes, we need to first clarify what gentrification means when we talk about that. And in this paper, we considered changes in racial and ethnic composition and displacement of original residents as potential outcomes of gentrification rather than its elements. So basically, we conceptualize gentrification as substantial socioeconomic neighborhood upgrading of formerly low-income and urban neighborhoods, which is largely driven by an influx of people with higher socioeconomic status from some other neighborhood. So that is basic idea that we had for gentrification, and how to measure that using some variables is kind of different story.
So Hyojung, the way you're conceptualizing gentrification, and I think we're trying to start with like the high level concept of gentrification in your mind and in Kristin Perkins' mind, your co-author.
Yep.
What you're capturing there to me is really focused on socioeconomic change of the individuals that occupy a neighborhood, as opposed to the physical changes that might be in a neighborhood that might accompany that socioeconomic change. It might not. It might happen before, it might happen after, etc. So you're really focusing on, your first concept is socioeconomic change in a neighborhood. And then, another thing that I think we want to specify there is like, that can be the result of lower income people moving out at a faster rate than they normally do. It can be a result of higher income people moving in faster than other places. But we haven't even gotten to that part yet, right? It's just changes in neighborhood composition according to the socioeconomic features of the individuals that live there. And then when I said, higher income, lower income. That can also be race. It could be education, right?
Sure. I mean, so there might be some other kind of aspect like cultural gentrification, like different kind of people with different cultural background comes in. So there are some conflict between the two groups, and then one group displaced out, something like that. Or there might be some other concept. But here we are using, socioeconomic terms. Maybe part of the reason why we are doing this is we wanted to compare our research with previous research. And previous research usually adopted this kind of idea of socioeconomic gentrification. And maybe the part of the reason why they did so was they could much easily find those, socioeconomic related variables rather than some variables that captures cultural differences like number of the maybe Korean restaurants in the area, number of the Starbucks in some area, something like that, right?
Yeah, it's a much harder thing to measure cultural change, especially given the data we have available. And I did want to just highlight here that what you're doing is, you're separating gentrification from displacement. I think for some people, those things go together. Often that's how I've talked about gentrification is like, it's not really gentrification unless people are being displaced, more than in other places. But that's just like kind of a personal preference. And I think there's value in what you're doing here in looking at places that have this socioeconomic change happening and looking at, whether the displacement outcomes actually differ depending on the kind of location. So I think there's a good reason to separate those two things, but I just want to make very clear that gentrification can happen or not in a place, and then displacement can happen or not. Displacement can be an outcome of that, but it might not be.
Exactly. So in regards to regional mobility, unfortunately, our definition includes both good and bad moves. That is, both forced and voluntary moves among those people who are in, gentrifying neighborhoods within a year. So that was largely due to the fact that the American Community Survey, which we use for our study, does not have any variable about the motivation for moving. So that was for one reason. Another reason was that, like, even if the ACES had that kind of reason for moving question, like other surveys such as like CPS ASAP or PSID, there have been some kind of measurement error, meaning that, people, when they decide to move, they may have more than one reason to do so. And the reasons that people report may not capture that kind of involuntary displacement that we are interested in.
Or they might, really emphasize that because that's really most prominent to them, but they might have actually ended up moving anyway and just kind of like attached to that explanation. It could go any direction. Very hard to know when people have multiple reasons for moving.
Right. I mean, it could be just housing reasons, but actually that was due to gentrification, something like that, right? And we don't know how they would answer that reason for moving question because there might be some kind of systemic differences in their reporting patterns across different types of people, maybe, So we just wanted to go with just to use the concept of regional mobility that includes all moves. So basic assumption that we had was that if gentrification involves the displacement, quote unquote, it should also increase the regional mobility of original residents in those areas. So if there are some relationship between gentrification and regional mobility, there could be a supportive evidence of arguing that, there is some relationship between gentrification and displacement.
Yeah, so let's talk about, before we get into your research in more detail, let's talk about the state of research on gentrification and displacement more broadly. There's been a lot published on these subjects, and the findings, I think, are pretty mixed and hard to make sense of. It seems like your goal in this study, or one goal, was to try to reconcile earlier findings by weaving together those three threads that I mentioned, the intensity of gentrification, the amount or type of displacement, and the metro area characteristics. So where did things stand when you embarked on this research, and what unresolved questions were you hoping to answer with it?
Sure. We often simply think that, gentrification causes displacement of original residents, especially when they are kind of low-income people and racial minority. But recent studies shows that it is less clear that there's such a strong relationship between the two. So some of the previous literature, especially those based on qualitative approach, based on survey or ethnographic approaches, show evidence that gentrification has very negative impact on long-time residents, like in terms of forced moves or increased housing cost burdens and dramatic kind of changes in neighborhood character.
Mm-hmm.
But other studies, like often based on like large scale data set with like really rigorous fancy sexy like econometric methods, show somewhat kind of mixed results, and it show much less dramatic gentrification effects than we previously thought. So when Kristin and I began our research, what we wanted to do was not only just empirically examine the relationship between gentrification and racial mobility, but also wanted to figure out why previous studies had reported somewhat kind of inconsistent findings. One possible explanation for the inconsistent finding was different definition and measures of gentrification using these kind of different studies, as we just talked before. So to address this kind of issue, we carefully selected a measure of gentrification that we thought that was the most relevant to the concept. And then we tested findings based on various definitions used in other studies. So that was something that we would argue that our contribution is. So spoiler alert is that the findings in terms of the relationship between gentrification and regional mobility that we found were pretty consistent across different measures. So in our appendix, there's a table that includes all the results based on dozens of different definitions. You can confirm that. Mm-hmm. And, I know it was kind of crazy to run all of them and tabulate the results in kind of one kind of big, huge table. So we basically called it kind of crazy table. Yeah, and then another candidate was geographic heterogeneity in the relationship between the two. Maybe, different areas might have somewhat different or distinctive local context that makes them have better or worse outcomes from the same urban phenomenon. But there has been relatively less discussion on this kind of issue. So sometimes some empirical studies basically focus on what happened in a single city, like New York, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco. And it's pretty difficult to generalize their findings to other cities with very different characteristics like, Denver, New Orleans, like Atlanta, something like that. And in other cases, researchers just simply put everything, from top 50 metros or top 100 metros and show just one national estimate of the association between the two and say, yeah, gentrification displaces people, or no, it does not. But what we suspected was maybe it depends, right? Mm-hmm. I know it's a magical word that works every time, but that's actually something important to know.
Yeah.
It's important because understanding whether there are some variations across different types of metros, that is important and necessary to find the different ways to address, potentially negative effects of gentrification, according to different local contexts that we can talk later.
Yeah, so I wanted to underline some of that for sure. I think I want the listeners to maybe appreciate like how, controversial the previous research on gentrification and displacement are, particularly on the quantitative side. So, the common understanding of gentrification is that it, at the very least, is a process that leads to the displacement of low-income people and racial minorities. And Hyojung, I think, articulated that very well. But as far as the quantitative research and evidence that we have on those processes, more often than not, I would say the evidence says not really. And so I'm thinking of probably an early-ish paper on this is Freeman and Bracconi, 2004, I think, Ellen and O'Regan in 2011. And then if you're listening at home and you want to look at like a summary of some of this really good research, Lei Ding and Jackie Wong have a great paper, I think, from 2019 that really spells out, what we know about the causes and consequences of gentrification. One of those consequences potentially being displacement. And all that is just, again, to underline, like we, as far as quantitative researchers, we all kind of shrug our shoulders and say, we can't really find evidence that changing neighborhoods means like there's some big acceleration in displacement on average. And I think the best explanation for that has been that maybe some people pay more money to stick around in neighborhoods as they're changing. Maybe the neighborhoods are improving along some dimensions that they're willing to pay more for. That's not necessarily like a great outcome, because then people are spending more of their household budget on rent to stay in a gentrifying neighborhood. But, it does, I think, give one explanation for why there's this kind of cloudy relationship between neighborhood gentrification and what we really think of as displacement.
And if that were at least part of the explanation for what's going on, I think it also helps sort of explain the difference between the qualitative research findings and the quantitative.
Right.
Because this is something that came up in our interview with Elizabeth Delmel, which also kind of touched on displacement around transit. And she made the point that these quantitative analyses are really looking at averages, essentially.
Right.
But there is no average person. People don't live their lives as averages. And so if some people are being displaced and other people are staying longer and willing to pay more for that, and that sort of washes out to no increased displacement, that doesn't really mean anything to the person who was displaced. The fact that someone else stayed longer and averaged out their displacement, like, what do they care, right? We should still be concerned with what happened to that person. And so this gets all back to Hyojung and Kristin's work on whether this is even happening, and maybe some of the washing out or canceling out is actually happening at the metro area level, where some metro areas are experiencing more displacement, others less. And it's kind of, when you put them all together, it doesn't look like much, but maybe depending on the conditions or circumstances in different kinds of metros, we see different results.
Right.
So let me just jump ahead here and say, at the heart of this analysis, what I think makes it novel and a step forward in this area of research is that grouping of metro areas into clusters based on characteristics that they share with each other, and that set them apart from others. You identified 8 clusters or groupings in total, and I'll just list those here really quickly. They were large coastal, large southern and Midwestern, inland empire / Texas border, southern, plains mountain, small Midwestern, retirement destinations, and college towns. So these are, again, like metro areas that all share some or many characteristics and distinguish them from other kinds of places. And again, the goal here was to assess whether there are different displacement outcomes in each of these geographies if we hold the intensity of gentrification constant. Aside from their names, which I think do a pretty good job of describing the kinds of places that we're talking about, or at least their, geographic location, what else should we know about these different geography clusters you identified and how you grouped them together?
Yeah. After we decided to see some difference between different types of the metros, we had to answer the question of how to do so, right? So we originally did that by running regressions by maybe census regions and by population size, by maybe housing prices, etc., and then realized that there are some issues with that. The first one was that there might be some confounding factors, and we may cherry pick whatever results that we want to show. And the second one was metros that are in the same, say, quintiles or quartiles, the same group, might have very different characteristics. So for the first issue, for example, suppose that we found relatively strong relationship between the two among those larger kind of metros like New York and like the kind of cities. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can conclude that either the city size that drives the stronger relationship or stronger gentrification effects here, because it could be actually maybe public transit system or urban amenities that played an important role in creating such close association or stronger effects. But also that kind of things could be found more often in those kind of bigger cities. So from that kind of approach, we cannot identify the real kind of causal factors, but we are just saying that these kind of things and conclude that this is something. So we just don't want it to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is that each metro has unique kind of local context that cannot be easily characterized by one or two variables. For example, if you can imagine like Boston, Detroit, Phoenix, Riverside, and San Francisco, those metros have quite similar populations at around 400, 500,000, but they are very different in many ways, right? So we just don't want to use the kind of one or two variables to kind of classify or like 366 MSAs. So we wanted to use more kind of, more systemic or subjective way to categorize them, which is called principal component analysis and cluster analysis. But that's kind of technical stories. So long story short,
yes, we appreciate that.
all of the most like variables into the model. So we did that. We got 8 clusters. But in doing so, we sometimes added some variables or removed some of the variables based on comments, thoughts by discussants and reviewers. But groupings were pretty robust. So it seems like there are such kind of groupings or clusters in the United States among those metros. So to us, it was interesting to see large coastal metros that include largest cities in the nation like New York, LA, DC. That have lots of, well-educated, high-income people and have high housing costs. And then, large southern Midwestern metros have pretty similar characteristics to the largest coastal, but to a lesser degree. So these two stands out. Mm-hmm. And among the rest of them, 3 metro clusters show very kind of distinctive characteristics, such as the Inland Empire and Mexico-Texas border metros have lots of the Hispanic people and higher poverty rate. And retirement destinations are those Florida cities or cities in Arizona have lots of the senior population, and college towns are some places like Blacksburg or some other college towns. And 3 other categories were just kind of like southern, placed mountain, and small Midwestern. Not only kind of similar characteristics, but also they were kind of geographically kind of concentrated in a certain kind of census region. So that was kind of interesting to see.
And really quickly, just to clarify, you clustered these before looking at displacement outcomes, right? So the displacement outcomes were not driving the selection or the grouping of these metro areas?
Not at all. So,
okay.
Yeah, so we wanted to exclude any kind of displacement or residential mobility related variables from our model so that these are kind of not giving a certain result, like given by that kind of result outcome variable.
And then to take a step back here, I think it's important just to think about or discuss, like, why would we maybe expect different effects of gentrification on displacement in different kinds of places? Like, what do we think is different about large coastal cities or plains mountain cities or retirement destinations that might lead to more or less displacement in those locations when gentrification occurs?
So when we think about these kind of different metropolitan areas, we thought they may have very different and distinctive characteristics in terms of their economy, in terms of their natural amenities, in terms of the temperatures you see. You guys are living in Southern California. I'm in eastern part.
It's been raining a lot here, though, man.
Surprisingly,
feel bad for us.
Don't you guys call it rainstorm, something like that?
Yeah, there were actual storms. I want my money back.
But on the other hand, metros are the lever that constitutes local labor and housing markets, and that means that people can change their jobs without changing their place of residence. Or they can find a new home within a reasonable commuting distance without changing their jobs. And in this kind of situation, metro's economic characteristics can influence a certain mobility decisions, or influence their neighbors' mobility decisions by changing housing prices, putting more burdens on housing, living up costs, etc., etc. So we thought there could be a very close relationship between gentrification, racial mobility, and metro level.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Another thing I found interesting is that you didn't just categorize neighborhoods as either gentrifying or not gentrifying. Mm-hmm. Instead of that binary, you've got a spectrum of 3 possibilities: not gentrifying, moderately gentrifying, and intensely gentrifying. Tell us how you measured that gentrification, in a little more detail. We've talked about socioeconomic upgrading, but I think we're talking very specifically about education here. And then what is your dividing line between a place that is moderately gentrifying versus intensely gentrifying?
Sure. So as we said, Kristin and I conceptualize gentrification as influx of residents with higher socioeconomic status into low income, and central city neighborhood. So there would be kind of denominator or universe that, which is gentrifiable neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And among them, there could be moderately and intensely gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So the first thing that we did was to define a gentrifiable neighborhood or a neighborhood that is at risk of gentrification as, low income and central urban census tract. So there are two kind of criteria. So one is low income neighborhood. Second one is central urban census tract. So for the first condition, we define census tract as low income when it has median household income in the bottom 40% of income distribution within a certain metropolitan area in 2010. And then to be considered like urban, central neighborhood, that must be within largest principal city in each MSAs and or second or third largest city if that has at least 100,000 residents.
Okay.
So, for example, if it is New York Metro, it'll be New York, and then White Plains. Mm-hmm. And if it is Los Angeles Metro, it'll be Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Anaheim. So they are considered as urban kind of neighborhoods.
Yeah. But I do think that's important to note because that's leaving out tons of places. And maybe we can assume that this is sort of generalizable, that the results in LA, Anaheim, and Long Beach can be, generalized to Inglewood and Santa Monica and Glendale, but maybe not, but you had to draw the line somewhere.
Exactly. So the first response after seeing this kind of list was, what about Pasadena? Or what about Santa Monica in LA? Now, I thought they are kind of in urban area, but somehow we wanted to use a certain approach that is consistent with previous studies that they basically analyze urban in that way. And we wanted to apply that to all metros, so we couldn't make any kind of exceptions or exclusions in there. Mm-hmm. And then among those kind of gentrifiable neighborhoods or neighborhoods at risk of gentrification, we classify a tract as gentrifying when that neighborhood experiences a substantial increase in its within MSA percentile rank of college graduate share from 2010 to 2019. So I see some of the listeners say, what? So, it is not merely increasing in college graduate share, but an improvement in its relative status within the MSA in terms of the college graduate share.
Right. So if the entire metro area has a rising share of college graduates and your neighborhood is sort of on track with that same rate as the metro overall, you're probably not changing your rank, and that's what you're measuring. But if the college graduate share in your neighborhood, in your census tract, is increasing at a faster rate than the metro area as a whole, then you might qualify as gentrifying if you're reaching one of these two thresholds that you set.
Exactly. And if a neighborhood ranking improves by, say, 5 to 14 percentiles, it would be classified as moderately gentrifying. And if that improves by 15 percentiles or more, it will be an intensely gentrifying neighborhoods. And that kind of 15 percentile threshold was selected because that was standard deviation when we did this kind of analysis. So that was kind of threshold. So if a certain neighborhood status improved from, say, 40th percentile to 60th percentile, that will be intensely gentrifying neighborhoods. From 20th to 30th, that will be moderately gentrifying neighborhoods. So that's how we classify them.
And I think moving that percentile, 10 or 20 percentiles in a 10-year period, just to be clear, is pretty significant.
Yeah, that's a lot. And I think, one thing that this gets at maybe a little bit indirectly is just how hard it is to time a gentrification process as an independent variable or dependent variable, because it's a very dynamic process. Neighborhoods change at different paces at different times. And I think by trying to capture, as you do, the intensity of gentrification, you're hopefully doing a little bit better job than some previous analyses at catching a neighborhood when it is actually gentrifying, because you're not just using this binary measure. There's just a little bit more nuance that hopefully gets at the timing a little bit better too.
Exactly. So one thing that we want to mention is we tested the robustness of this definition of gentrification by changing the low-income threshold to other ways and changing that kind of VA plus share to housing prices or some other measures.
BA plus being bachelor's degree or higher education.
Thank you. But you can find it in our crazy table. The main findings were pretty consistent across different definitions. So maybe people think very seriously about how we define gentrification in this way and that way. But the key thing is that whether we can find the consistent findings across different definitions or not, rather than this definition is best capture the idea of gentrification versus another.
So we've talked about how, residential mobility is an umbrella term. Really, it captures things that we would consider displacement, but also things we would just consider good. Moving for a new job, move into a bigger home, a nicer home, a neighborhood you prefer to live in, whatever. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you measured residential mobility and at least tried to isolate the quote-unquote bad moves or the displacement in those results. You did a few things to try to identify those moves specifically, even if you can't do it precisely. And so tell us a little bit about the choices you made and the maybe filtering of certain moves where you didn't consider them versus the ones you did.
Sure. So as I mentioned before, unfortunately, we could not distinguish good and bad moves, but what we could identify was whether a person moved to a different neighborhood within a year. So, for example, if we use the 2011 ACS data, what we can identify is those people who are in gentrifying neighborhoods in 2010 and those people who are gentrifiable but non-gentrifying neighborhoods in 2010 and what happened to them in 2011. So comparing these kind of two groups, if we find the people in gentrifying neighborhoods more often than those people in non-gentrifying neighborhoods, we can say that there's a positive relationship between gentrification and racial mobility. That was our kind of regular default outcome. And although we could not distinguish those bad moves from good moves, but we also used some other mobility outcomes that could include potentially some bad moves. So, for example, we could identify whether a person moved to a different city or different metro, assuming that kind of long distance moves might have more disruptive effects for those, especially for those kind of vulnerable people, right? And then we also measured neighborhood poverty rate and median household income, assuming that if somebody moved to a neighborhood that has a poverty rate greater than his or her origin neighborhood, or moved to a neighborhood with lower household income compared to their origin neighborhood, then it may indicate a kind of downward mobility. So we examined the relationship between gentrification and racial mobility, not only in terms of the quantity, like mobility rate, but also in terms of its quality, whether they move to worse neighborhood or not.
I think that's a really important measure. And someone might be thinking, well, sometimes people move to poorer neighborhoods and it's not a bad thing. But I think when you're finding, or if you were to find that those kinds of moves were more common in gentrifying neighborhoods, either moderately or intensely, than in non-gentrifying neighborhoods, that might be some sign that actually these are moves made under duress or, involuntarily, where they couldn't afford to live in the place they were in anymore or got evicted or whatever and had to move to somewhere a little less expensive. I did want to call out also, I don't think you mentioned this, but my recollection is that you're really only looking at moves for people who don't have a bachelor's degree. And so you're looking, again, at kind of a less educated and presumably lower income, a little more vulnerable population, and not so much worried about, the moves of people who have bachelor's degrees and above who probably have a little more options and aren't so vulnerable to involuntary displacement.
Exactly. So we restricted our sample to those people 25 and older with less than bachelor's degree because we think, gentrification is having much more greater impacts on those people with fewer resources on one hand. But on the other hand, we tested this idea as well with renters, low-income people, or just over 25 and older population, including those people with bachelor's degree. But results are pretty consistent. So it seems like gentrification do have more disruptive impacts on more vulnerable people with fewer resources. It is true, but the results are pretty consistent even when we included those people as well.
Yeah. Something I didn't think about there was how even if you are displaced involuntarily, but you have a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree, then, it's still bad but you probably are able to recover from that a little more easily than someone with less resources. Just on average, again, this is not going to be true for everyone, but I think that's important to note. So something that we've talked about on this podcast before is how a lot of attention in the media and I think in the research community is given to gentrifying neighborhoods. But there are many more neighborhoods across the country that are actually becoming more poor or more segregated over time, or both. To put that another way, if you pick a random neighborhood on a map of the US, it's not very likely that it's gentrifying. And that's not to dismiss the problems occurring in gentrifying neighborhoods, especially as someone living in LA where this is really a problem. But I'm noting it here partly as a corrective, but also to introduce this question. To give us a sense of scale, how many neighborhoods in your study were classified as gentrifiable, and how many did you not include in your analysis at all because you didn't consider them gentrifiable during the study period? And then among those gentrifiable neighborhoods, what share of them fell into each of the categories of non-gentrifying, moderately gentrifying, and intensely gentrifying? I just want to be sure that we have a sense for how much of the country is really being analyzed here and how much isn't even really concerned with gentrification and is maybe experiencing totally different problems.
Sure. So I'm totally agree with you on that. And our research actually shows that the majority of neighborhoods are not experiencing gentrification. Actually, one of Kristin's paper shows that the most common trajectory for neighborhood is just stability, kind of no change. And yes, maybe there has been too much attention paid to those gentrifying neighborhoods among urban scholars, given that these kind of non-gentrifying neighborhoods have long been experiencing lots of issues such as systemic underinvestment, like neighborhood instability, and some social inequality and segregation. With that said, our analysis shows that it is not an insignificant number of neighborhoods that experience gentrification. So let me throw some numbers here. So in the 2010 Census Geography, there's about 73,000 census tracts or neighborhoods, and about 60,000 among them are within 366 MSA. So 60,000 neighborhoods are in metro area.
It's like 80%, right?
Sure, about 80%, yes. And among them, about 12,500 or 13,000 census tracts, or about 20% of those neighborhoods within MSA, are considered to be gentrifiable, meaning that they are located in urban areas and they are low-income neighborhoods. And as you said, those neighborhoods would be our geography of interest or denominator or universe, whatever we can say, right? And among those gentrifiable neighborhoods, about 36% or 4,500 census tracts were gentrified from 2010 to 2019. And another 64% or 8,000 neighborhoods were gentrifiable, but not gentrified. So about 36 versus 64. And then 36% can be divided into two groups. So 21% that is moderately gentrified and 15% that is intensely gentrified. So that's the basic idea that we can have. So I know there are lots of the numbers, but hope that this kind of thing gives you how many neighborhoods were gentrifiable in 2010 and how many were actually gentrified in 2010 to 2019.
Yeah, there were enough steps there that I think I lost the final rough calculation. But maybe you could tell me, so we started with there are just 72,000 census tracts, period, right? Or 70-something thousand.
Yep.
How many census tracts did you find were moderately gentrifying and how many were intensely gentrifying?
So there's about 73,000 in the United States as a nation, and then 60,000 in the metro.
Let's just skip from the 73,000 or 6,000. I keep forgetting the number. Let's just skip from that to just the number of tracts that were gentrifying in both kinds. If you have those figures, I'm just like, is it? I'm struggling to, is it 5% in each of the the gentrifying categories, and we're going to delete what I'm saying right now, just to be clear, or is it 10 or 15%? What does it add up to?
Okay, so as I mentioned, there are about 73,000 neighborhoods in the nation, and ultimately there was about 4,500 census tracts that were gentrified from 2010 to 2019. That gives us 6.2% of the nation's neighborhoods were gentrified in our definition.
Okay,
based
got it.
on our definition.
And yeah, as you say, that's not an insignificant number. And as a reminder, we're only looking at those urban census tracts. Those are the only ones you even consider gentrifiable. And in the case of Los Angeles, that's excluding anything lower than the third largest city. So Pasadena, Santa Monica, Glendale, Inglewood, all these places would not even be considered, but they might actually be gentrifying. They weren't part of this analysis.
Right. So you can take it as very conservative kind of approach to restrict our sample to real urban area. But actually, what Kristin and I are doing is analyzing what happened in suburban area in terms of suburban gentrification. So stay tuned for that kind of research.
Great.
So one thing that's interesting as a researcher to me about this paper is that you can't just grab public census data and get information on residential mobility like this. So can you talk about what source of data you used to identify movers and what you can do with those data?
Yeah, and the data set that we used was somewhat kind of unique. It's an internal version of the American Community Survey that can be only accessed from what is called like Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, and it's long, by some authorized researchers. So in that regard, I must say the results and conclusions mentioned in here, in this podcast, is ours and do not necessarily reflect the views of Census Bureau. And those results discussed here, whether they are shown in our paper, appendix, or not, were actually reviewed by the Census Bureau's Disclosure Review Board. And I wanted to say this because for the record.
Yeah.
So for us, access to data was necessary as internal ACS data provide kind of detailed geography information regarding current residents for all individuals and previous residents for recent movers at census block level. And that kind of accuracy was the key for this study as public version of the microdata set called ACS PUMS, or public use microdata sample, has the same variable but at PUMA level, or public use microdata area level, which is generally greater than zip code or sometimes even greater than county for some rural areas. So it has been not possible to conduct this type of neighborhood level analysis using the ACS public data set, but it became possible with the internal and confidential version of the ACS data.
Nice.
So I think we've now, pretty far into this, set the stage enough that we can talk about results and have them mean something to our listeners and not be misinterpreted as meaning something different. You did this analysis for the entire nation as a single sample, but then also for each geographic cluster. What did you find for the national sample, and what were some of the highlights for the different geographies?
Sure. So let me first tell you what we found in our kind of national sample. So when we run the regression using the aggregate national sample of 366 metropolitan area, we found that the probability of moving to a different neighborhood, out of neighborhood, is about 0.4 percentage points higher among those people in moderately gentrified neighborhoods compared to non-gentrified neighborhoods, and about 1 percentage point higher among those people who are in intensely gentrified neighborhoods, controlling for everything. And we also tested some other mobility outcomes that I mentioned before, right? So first, when we tested whether gentrification is associated with short distance versus long distance moves, it turned out that gentrification, especially intense gentrification, is associated with the moves across MSA boundary.
So longer distance moves.
Exactly. So somebody in LA moved to, say, San Francisco or
probably not that move specifically. if it's involuntary, they're not going to move to an even more expensive place. But
Las Vegas.
I take your meaning. Yeah.
Let it ride. Go to Las Vegas.
And in addition, when we tested whether gentrification is associated with destination neighborhood quality or like downward mobility, our result basically shows that movers from moderately and intensely gentrified neighborhoods ends up in higher poverty neighborhoods than their origin neighborhoods, saying about 0.7 percentage points or 1.4 percentage points higher. And in terms of median household income, movers from gentrified neighborhoods tend to move to neighborhoods with lower income. So both variables indicate that those people from, gentrified neighborhoods not only have higher probability of moving, but also, higher probability of downward moving. So both quantity and quality of mobility, they are worse.
And how about for some of these individual geographies or these clusters of geographies? Like, how did the results sort of align with the national results, and how did they differ in some places?
Right. So, and then we examined whether that kind of association between the two varies across different type of the metropolitan areas, right? So, in the large coastal metros like LA, New York, Chicago is not coastal but still large. The probability of moving was somewhat similar with national numbers. It is understandable. They have lots of the population that can drive most of the things that we found in national estimates. And then estimated coefficients were slightly higher in large southern and midwestern metros compared to those large coastal metros. So they are pretty similar, but slightly higher.
Slightly more displacement given, whatever level of gentrification.
I would say slightly more probability of moving and slightly more probability of downward mobility as well.
Okay.
So, and then in retarded destination and college-town metros show somewhat, distinctive patterns, as moderate gentrification is associated with moving to a different neighborhood by 2.5 percentage points and 2.1 percentage points, that kind of large number. But gentrification was not necessarily associated with downward mobility in terms of neighborhood poverty and median income in those areas. So they move more often if someone is in gentrified neighborhood, but that doesn't necessarily lead to downward mobility. And in southern Plains Mountain and small Midwestern metros, intense gentrification matter that was associated with the higher probability of moving to a different neighborhood, but not necessarily so for moderate gentrified neighborhood. So that was somewhat differences across different type of the metros.
Something I want to point out here that I think supports your findings is that because you did this spectrum of non-gentrifying, moderately gentrifying, and intensely gentrifying, if the theory that gentrification leads to displacement, or at least residential mobility of certain kinds, then we might expect that places that gentrify more would have higher rates of displacement, or the rate would increase by a greater amount. And that's pretty much what you find across the board, both in the national sample and in most geographic clusters. And so I think that's just kind of further support that there is really a connection between these things. If what you were seeing was, the moderately gentrifying places had maybe the same displacement or mobility rates as intensely gentrifying, or especially if they had higher rates of mobility than these intensely gentrifying places, we might start to question, like, well, is it really the gentrification? Because why wouldn't you expect more mobility as gentrification increased? But that's what you found. And I think that's a really important thing to call out here. So thinking about ways people might challenge this research, what do you think about the critique that metro areas are just too heterogeneous, too variable for each to be classified into a single group? You got your PhD in Los Angeles, as you said, so you're very familiar with the variety of neighborhoods that you can find here. I'm thinking of neighborhoods like Palms, Highland Park, North Hollywood, the community around USC in South LA, all of which are or recently were pretty low income. Those neighborhoods are all part of the Los Angeles metro area, and in that sense, they have a lot in common, but they also each have unique characteristics and demographics and economic and social pressures that might result in different responses to gentrification. And even though I use LA here as an example, I'm sure the same could be said for every metro area in the country. I realize that this isn't entirely a fair question or critique because you've already taken a big step forward in spatial differentiation, let's call it, compared to previous gentrification and displacement research. But I'm wondering if this kind of grouping actually creates maybe new analytical problems in some ways and what it might mean for future research.
Sure. So I do agree that there could be a wide intra-metropolitan variation, especially in larger metros like New York, LA, Chicago, San Francisco, and San Jose. But Kristin and I first wanted to make sure that there's some level of spatial heterogeneity across areas. And if there are some spatial heterogeneity, then we thought metro might be the first geographic level to test, given that there is a wide variety among metropolitan areas in terms of, say, size, and then demographic composition, economic capacity, urban form, and other things. And also, demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of in-movers can be very different across different types of the metros, as some are moving for techie jobs, while others moving for affordable homes for larger families, and others for their retirement destination, right? So when they first determine which cities to move, and then they compare the neighborhoods within the city, meaning that there will be more variation across the metropolitan area than within metropolitan area in terms of their kind of characteristics of the in-movers. That was our thinking.
Yeah.
But I think it is totally possible that gentrification happening in, say, around the USC area would be totally different from what's happening in, say, Old Pasadena or some other areas. So definitely further research would be needed for that kind of thing. And in part, we are doing that as well. So we are applying the method that we use for this kind of metro classification to neighborhoods and see what's happening in different type of the neighborhoods. So whether it is like Hispanic enclaves versus like working class neighborhoods versus multi-family neighborhoods versus some single family neighborhoods.
So given the types of metros that you see the biggest and smallest effects, I think there is some evidence there that high or rising rents is playing a strong role. Do you agree with that? And, you've touched on some mechanisms, but are there other mechanisms that you think are going on there?
Sure. So about the factors that is associated with the relationship that we found, right?
Yeah.
So Chris and I thought this paper's main contribution would be just exploring the spatial heterogeneity in the relationship between the two using the most, maybe arguably the most comprehensive data and approach. But on the other hand, we thought it would be amazing if we could find these specific factors, right, explaining these kind of differences. But long story short, we couldn't. So let me say how we ultimately got results. So first, basically what we did was we classified these kind of 366 MSAs into three groups, like totiles, like top 33%, middle 34%, and bottom 33% by a certain metropolitan characteristics that we used for TCA analysis. For example, it could be college graduate share, it could be poverty rate, it could be, residential segregation index, etc., etc. And our assumption, our thought was that if we can find some, stronger relationship among top 33% MSAs versus bottom 33% MSAs based on a certain metropolitan characteristics, then it could be an indicator of this is, and it's related to a certain, relationship. This could be potential factor around the relationship that we found. But when we run this kind of regression, we couldn't find any kind of conclusive relationships, but still the share of newly built housing units and vacancy rates explain some heterogeneity across areas. And population growth was also shows some relationship, but and there was some statistical significance, but that was not strong enough to argue in our manuscript. So we decided just focusing on describing this kind of metro heterogeneity rather than arguing that this is a factor associated with the relationship that we found.
Right. And that's a common thing we have to do is to not speak past what the data can conclude, right? That's good. Another thing is that we've talked certainly a couple of times about, whether gentrification and displacement are kind of the most common or pressing problems in a lot of urban areas. But there's another piece of that kind of line of thinking, which is how strong the effects are here. What is the magnitude of this connection that you find? So if I can interpret at least one of the key findings is that residential mobility rates are roughly 1 percentage point higher in the most intensely gentrifying neighborhoods. And, I don't want to sound glib about that, but it doesn't seem like a big difference to me, particularly when you consider that a lot of those moves are going to be for perfectly fine reasons or not forced, et cetera. So after reading your paper, I'm definitely more convinced that gentrification affects displacement. But I'm not yet necessarily convinced that it's like this big driver of displacement. So, Do you agree with that take, or what might I be missing there?
Sure. So as you mentioned, people in intensely gentrifying neighborhoods has just 1 percentage point higher probability of moving than others. So it may sound not that kind of substantial, right? But here are 2 things to consider. So first one is that in our sample, the average mobility rate was about 9.2%. And that makes that 1 percentage point pretty crucial, as that indicates that probability of moving would be 11% higher in gentrifying neighborhoods compared to those people in gentrifiable but non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So just 1 percentage point sounds small, but 11% sounds much bigger.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the second thing to consider is that our measure of regional mobility is about migration within 12 months or a year. So for those people who answered 2011 ACS, they asked where they lived in 2010. So it is 1 year mobility rate. That means that, 9.2% mobility rate. So about 1/10 of all people with less than bachelor's degree in those low-income neighborhoods are moving every year. And gentrifiable neighborhoods have 1 percentage point higher mobility rate every year. So that might give there might be some frequent movers moving here to there, like churning neighborhoods over time. Yeah. But if we add up that kind of difference over, say, 5 years or 10 years, we would be able to see quite substantial differences in regional mobility or retention between gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So that's something that I would argue.
Thank you. As I said in the previous question, I'm more convinced after reading your paper that gentrification is a factor in displacement. With this evidence, what should policymakers do about this problem?
So the key message that we ultimately wanted to deliver in this article was that gentrification can be found in many different types of metros. And when we talk about its relationship with regional mobility or displacement, local contexts matter. So we should think about how substantial neighborhood upgrades or neighborhood improvements can be translated into the everyday life of residents in the specific local context. And there cannot be a just one-size-fits-all type of policies that can fix all the negative outcomes of gentrification in all the different types of metros. I mean, it may sound like I'm a little bit overly cautious, but I think it's better to be extremely careful rather than be reckless or irresponsible in any kind of policymaking process that can determine some winners and losers. And that kind of local, kind of specific policies can be thought as something like, for example, like recent paper by Casey Dragon and Ingrid Allen and Sherry Clyde basically shows that mobility rates are notably lower among those families living in subsidized housing or public housing, even when they are located in gentrifying neighborhoods. And children in gentrifying neighborhoods experience much larger improvements in their neighborhood environment, such as lower crime rates or higher school performances. So if we think about, if there are some well-performing local PHA or public housing agency, and market mechanism cannot be able to provide like low-income family houses in that kind of area, maybe public housing might be a good solution for that kind of specific area, especially gentrification is associated with downward mobility. For some other cases, if gentrification is not necessarily associated with downward mobility or higher mobility rate, then we might think gentrification might not necessarily be a bad thing, but we should do some more research to find out, other than these kind of measures, if there are some other kind of negative impacts of gentrification in such neighborhoods, such as like what we talk about, right? Like economic or cultural displacement rather than purely socioeconomic displacement.
If I can push on this a little bit, I feel like definitely the takeaway that context matters and we need to take that into account makes all the sense in the world. But I'm just thinking about, like, in practical terms, what we do with that, because I think there's a lot of different ideas about what causes gentrification and what you do about it. And also there's the fact that gentrification is happening in many places, like, regardless of whether you're making investments necessarily. A lot of this can be driven entirely by private individual decisions of people moving into or out of neighborhoods. And so, is this about being careful about where we invest public resources? Is it about displacement protections and mitigations and that kind of thing? I mean, I'm sure the answer is like, it's all these things and more, but like, could you say a little bit more about how this all fits together and maybe how we go from like recognizing that the context matters and you might need different solutions to like what we actually do with that information, or what kinds of policies or decisions that awareness should inform?
Yeah, I mean, this is a part that I'm saying I'm maybe overly cautious because I cannot argue something for a certain type of the neighborhoods, because what we found was basically differences across metropolitan areas rather than different factors across different areas. So I would say there should be more and more research conducted in this matter to find out that kind of factors, potential factors or determinants or mechanisms that drives the relationship between gentrification and racial mobility in certain areas. So the reason why I'm saying this is that in general, researchers have a little more focused on what's happening in big cities, like superstar cities, like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. But it turned out that some previously overlooked metropolitan areas, like smaller metros or college towns or retirement communities, also experiences this type of gentrification and potentially displacement issues. So what we are arguing is that these kind of neighborhoods deserve some attention, and researchers should recognize the difference between the different areas and should do some more research to find out the factors so that answer your question and Mike's question about what should we do based on what we found, rather than just saying that we should do this in this kind of neighborhood or do that kind of thing in that neighborhood without knowing anything about that kind of area.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, what we're not saying here is we just need to wait for more research to decide what to do in different kinds of neighborhoods, but we're just going to have to keep trying different things, doing our best based on what we do know about neighborhoods, seeing how different kinds of interventions or protections or what have you actually work. And I mean, that's at some level that needs to be done so that people like us can study how effective or ineffective they are. But ideally, with the research we have now, that should inform at least a little bit of the kinds of decisions we're making, knowing that the people moving into a neighborhood are kind of young, upwardly mobile, college educated versus retirees versus immigrants from Mexico. Like that should have some bearing on the kinds of policies and programs we put in place to try to protect people and provide some housing stability for them.
Thanks. I like your answer much more than mine. So.
Well, with that wonderful compliment, I'll close this up here. Hyojung Lee, thank you so much for coming on the Housing Voice podcast.
Thank you, Shane. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
You can read more about Hyojung's research on our website, lewis.ucla.edu. Show notes and a transcript of the interview are there too. The UCLA Lewis Center is on Facebook and Twitter. I'm on Twitter at Shane D. Phillips, and Mike is at MC_lens. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.